Thanks everyone for being here, and let's get started. Welcome everybody to Separation of Church and State During a Time of Crisis, a virtual town hall with New York State Assembly Member Harvey Epstein. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Paul Golan. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and I'm staff lead of our initiative, Jews for a Secular Democracy. Just by way of a brief introduction of those organizations and initiatives, and I'm in Brooklyn, so I just closed my window. Society for Humanistic Judaism is a denomination of North American Judaism. We take a cultural rather than religious approach to Jewish life. And folks want to learn more about that, we're at shj.org. Jews for a Secular Democracy is a pluralistic initiative because we believe Jews of all backgrounds and beliefs would agree that separation of church and state have a unique perspective, that Jews have a unique perspective on separation of church and state, and not just Jews, but our friends, family members, allies, the Jew adjacent, as I like to call them. We're genuinely a mixed multitude today as far as our community in America. The separation of church and state is and has been complicated. It's been an ongoing debate since the founding of our country and the writing of the First Amendment. But it's a groundbreaking innovation that ultimately has allowed minority groups like Jews to flourish in America much more than in other countries, even in other democracies. Therefore, we feel it is certainly worth defending. So we wanted to raise up issues around church and state separation from a Jewish perspective, like reproductive justice, which is often litigated around one religion's view of when life begins, or LGBTQ equality, because Jews overwhelmingly support gay marriage, despite our tradition providing the original source texts that religious fundamentalists use to continue weaponizing religion against gays and lesbians. And perhaps most relevant these days is science education and utilizing science in policy making decisions. So you can learn more about the Jews for Secular Democracy initiative at jewsdemocracy.org or at facebook.com/jewsdemocracy. And joining me and fielding questions for our guest are my colleagues working on the Jews for Secular Democracy initiative, Lincoln Dow and Sarah Levin. So you'll hear from them in a bit, but now we're thrilled to welcome New York State Assembly Member Harvey Epstein, who represents the east side of Manhattan. Assembly Member Epstein has been a community leader for more than 20 years. Before he was elected to the Assembly, he served on Community Board 3 for 14 years, serving as its board chair and chairing its land use committee. A public school parent, Harvey is a former president of the District 1 President's Council and former PTA president at the neighborhood school where his children attend. And both my kids are also in New York City public schools. So maybe afterwards we can commiserate about how things are going, because right now I think they're in the other room playing video games, probably using
they're definitely playing video games. There's no question about it.
The struggle is real. In his first term in office, Harvey co-authored and passed the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019 that protects tenants and preserves affordable housing in New York City. He passed legislation that has created a dedicated funding stream for public transit, expanded early voting for New Yorkers, codified Roe v. Wade in the state of New York, protecting a woman's right to choose, and supported legislation to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions. So thank you so much for being here today. I'm hoping we can have a wide-ranging conversation, but to keep with the focus of our initiative, I'd like to start with separation of church and state. So from your perspective as an elected official, what is the appropriate relationship between religion and government in general?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me, Paul, and for Sarah and Lincoln for being a part of this. I really appreciate it. And this is really important conversations we should be having across our country, especially in these times where the lines between religion and policy continue to blur. And as someone who believes that I'm a Jew, I'm a secular Jew, I believe in my values, I don't believe that my values are the only values that exist on the planet. And those values are important to me, but they're not universally shared. And so it's important to understand that in the context of what we're doing in the world and what we're doing today. So as a state legislator, I want to create spaces to respect other people's values, but also create spaces to respect mine. And that's a really difficult moment in this kind of environment we're in. We're in a very difficult time in our society, in our country, and in our world. And right-wing extremists and religious right-wing extremists are on the rise. And it is the sense that they're right and the rest of us don't exist on the planet. And so it's really important to share a message saying that I can respectfully disagree with your values, but you have to respectfully disagree with mine. If I, example, we use all the time, I'm pro-choice. I believe life begins at birth, and until the birth of a child, the mother's right to choose is her right exclusively. And that's just my values and my beliefs. And I'm not going to push that on someone else. I'm not going to tell someone else they have to listen to me. I'm just going to say, since I believe this, you have to respect my views. Now, someone who believes life begins at conception, not my lens on the world, not my religious belief, not anything that I understand, but doesn't mean I don't disagree with you. I'm just saying, well, then don't have an abortion if you don't want one. So this lines are clear that this individual freedom is a really important thing. I'm not trying to push you to believe what I believe, but don't push me to have limitations to force us to believe what you believe.
That's great. Thank you. But of course, there is no black and white. There are gray areas, and maybe we can get into some of that as well. But in the context of what's happening today in terms of this pandemic, as an example, in some states, there have been exemptions to shelter-in-place orders for religious gatherings. And I know, obviously, here in New York City, we've had some controversy just in the past couple of days with funerals in the Hasidic communities that are not abiding by the measures that are put into place to protect people. How do you navigate that? How do you, certainly like in times of crisis, how do you balance the individual rights with the protection of society in general?
Yeah. Well, there's an interesting idea around what we believe around the First Amendment, where my freedom, my rights only go as far as infringing on yours. So if we all decide that you want religious freedom, it can't be at the risk for someone else, right? And basically, in this moment of a pandemic, if we have religious gatherings, not only do we risk other people, which is what we're talking about by not infringing other people's rights, but we risk people we don't even know, not the people who are there at the funeral, but it's a healthcare worker you've never met before. It's a person who's in the ambulance driving you to the hospital. It's the home health worker who might have to support you. You're risking potentially hundreds of other people's lives by making a decision around religious freedom. And religious freedom is not, uniquely independent of any other freedom. You have freedom of First Amendment, freedom to expression. Your religious freedoms have to have limits. And in this environment, they have to have these limits. And so my mother's a very religious Jew, and she goes to services, I don't know, a lot, not just on Friday and Saturday. I don't think it's, 4 other days during the week. I'm not really paying attention because I don't do that. But she does it by Zoom. They won't Zoom on Saturday because it's a Shabbos. They do Friday night before sundown, and that's what they do. So right. There's easy ways to comply if you want to. No one loves the idea of not being able to go to a funeral for someone they love, their rabbi, their community leader, of lots of friends and colleagues that have passed away. That is deeply hurting to me. But you have to figure out other ways to do it. And so, with technology today, you could have 5,000 people at a funeral for a rabbi on Zoom, and everyone could have shown and loved in the same way. You can sit Shiva remotely. You can do a lot of things. And I think we have to be respectful of the risk that we're causing others by coming together. But it's not just Jews. Obviously, there are lots of people making bad choices. I walk my dog I live in Manhattan. I walk my dog to the East River. I pass probably 30 joggers, white middle-class folk, it seem like, who are not wearing masks, who are not covering up, who are just walking or running by me. The stupid plane that went overhead not stupid, but the plane that went overhead that we wanted to celebrate New York. there were hundreds of people lined up to watch it, not socially distancing. So you get a nice day like we might have this weekend, you'll have people sitting in a park. So Jews are not the only ones who are not respecting it. Mostly Jews are respecting it. Small segments of Jews are not. So we shouldn't label a whole community, but we have to say these are smart decisions. And religion, while so important to you, has to be in the context of risking other people as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I've also thought about that. It was the same day as this big Hasidic funeral that got all of the media attention. But at the same day, huge crowds were gathering in Manhattan to watch the flyover. I watched it from my roof. I figured they had to burn the gas anyway, right? I mean, it's paid for. Our military budget is gigantic. They've spent that money anyway. They might as well fly it over New York. And it's exciting. It's the thing we do best is make amazing warplanes, sadly. But it was remarkable that the attention was focused on this community, and seeing it on Facebook. I'm torn because I want to chide that any group that gets together right now, and at the same time, I also, it's a gray area. There's this not clearly definable border where, because they look so identifiably Orthodox, that I think they have gotten more heat for that, and it's certainly not the majority of their community, but it's a significant segment who are doing it. So there's this difficult balance as a non-Orthodox Jew on how to even address those things. So I appreciate your.
I think the way to address it, I think, is just not to clump people like the mayor did. Not to say Jews stop doing this. It's like, well, no, Jews are not doing it. 1 million Jews in New York City, and we're not doing that. We're doing as much as we possibly can. A lot of us, I'm sure some are not, but I think the vast majority of people are being socially distant and being responsible. And there are people who are Catholic. There's some people who are Buddhist. There are people who are Muslim. There are people of all faiths not doing the right thing. And we should say people who are not doing the right thing need to do the right thing. So if you're watching a flyover not doing the right thing, or if you're going to a memorial and not doing the right thing, or if you're going shopping and not doing the right thing, you need to regroup, think, and do the right thing here. And it's about saving lives. We've lost way too many people in this city, in this country.
Yep. And that kind of is an additional gray area, though, because I did see people calling the mayor an anti-Semite for that statement, which I certainly wouldn't agree with either. I think it's just he just, first of all, it's the danger of Twitter, right? I mean, he wrote something that was on his mind, and he really should have thought it out before he wrote it. And I don't see him and the service that he's provided and the work he's done with Jews in New York City, that, this one bad statement, now we can call him an anti-Semite. So it's just these borders and gray areas around it are constant. And it is one of the things that we're grappling with all the time when we try to focus on issues around separation of church and state. In a lot of other parts of the United States, there are large evangelical Christian communities, and they're really driving a lot of the legislation, pushing basically a Christian fundamentalist agenda on the US and in those states. It doesn't feel like we've got that in New York State. But what have you seen in terms of issues around separation of church and state in New York? Your bio points to what happened this past year on Roe v. Wade, and my sense was that was kind of in defense of what is anticipated might happen on the national level. So can you talk a bit to separation of church and state issues from your view, working in the New York State government?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking. First, we all have to acknowledge the rise of anti-Semitism and white nationalism in our country, and New York doesn't get a pass. Even in my neighborhood, which is, I represent the Lower East Side. This is like where Jews came for 100 years, right? We've seen a rise in anti-Semitism, and I think it has to do with the message we were hearing from the White House and the tenor of the conversation that, hate is on the rise because hate is being spewed every single day from the Oval Office, and he just reinforcing that people who are allowed to hate have a voice and they want to accentuate their voice. So that's clear. It's unfortunate, but it is clear. So the question then is, what do we do about it? And so, it's hard to counter with hate with much else, right? You can't, once people get to a place of that level of hatred and bigotry, it's hard. But education has to be a pathway. And it's not just around anti-Semitism, obviously it's around racism, sexism, homophobia. There's a path of hate that if you're anti-Semitic, you're likely to have racial-based issues, gender-based issues, homophobia. Those all seem to go hand in hand. So we have a portion of the population, who I think just, lived in a really sheltered environment, wasn't exposed to people of difference, and because of that, it's fear of other, fear of difference. And so part of what we were talking about this year is, how do we change that? How do we expand opportunities for people to understand difference, understand the history of race and racism, and how, just because slavery ended, the underpinnings of racism are still alive and well in our society. Just because women had the right to vote in 1929 doesn't mean sexism doesn't continue to a huge problem in our society. Homophobia, just because a gay or lesbian couple have a right to vote doesn't mean we're in a post-homophobic society, or rights of transgender New Yorkers. We need to be clear that it is the fear of other and the fear of the unknown that drives so many people. And it's part of our responsibility as government is to educate people as early as possible, and respecting different forms of families, different forms of experiences. Now, I know that the right wing don't want to hear that, because they want to be in this space where they're using religion as a tool to reinforce their hate. But our job is to say, well, it isn't really religion. It's your view of the world, and love is love. And you have to, if you don't want to be in a same-sex relationship, don't. If you don't want to talk to people who are different race or genders, don't. But they're not any less than anyone else. And in some ways, you just have to respect people and love who they are. And if you can't, then you should figure out a different way to function in the world. You just can't spew your hate just because you live in a closed-minded society.
I think that's a great point. And, we really focused our initiative on issues, but you're getting at a larger point that we may want to also incorporate around just tolerance and understanding. And there's an aspect of that that is just very American. And so it can be wrapped together into patriotism and being American and what we actually value. So I really appreciate that perspective. I also just go ahead.
I was going to say, it's kind of a taboo thing, but my religious education was part of what we taught, where Jews were, quote, the chosen people. And we have to move away from that. No one's chosen. We're all on this planet. And I believe that people were brought here to do whatever they do with a purpose. We all have a value to give back to the earth and give back to the people we're living with. And no one's, I'm not better or worse because I'm Jewish. I am who I am. And we just have to allow us to be just regular human beings, not specific like that as a Jew or a Christian or a Buddhist or a Muslim. We're not different. We're just having to live our lives, and just kind of move away from that sense that we're special. As a Jew, I was taught specific things. I was taught to question. I was taught to fight. I was taught to not just go along with the masses. And there's a fundamental belief in my religion that made me question everything, and probably helps me be who I am today. It doesn't make me special. It just makes me have an education helping me drive who I am.
Wow. Well, I wasn't going to go there because we were going to focus on Jews for a secular democracy, but that message is really a humanistic one. And it's one that, we in Humanistic Judaism really, it really resonates with me personally, I think with a lot of folks in our movement. So thank you for that. I mean, for us, ultimately, the bottom line, regardless of belief, is that it's up to humans to make the world a better place. I mean, in all of liberal Judaism, that phrase tikkun olam is in high use.
Right.
For us, it may be a little bit more specified that it's only humans that are going to be able to solve human problems. But either way, it's up to people. And I think it's been heightened perhaps more than ever in our lifetimes, because who's going to rescue us right now? It's the really smart people who have dedicated their lives to addressing vaccinations or pandemics, or it's the people who are uh, delivering our food, literally. I mean, it's up and down the whole chain of life, but it's people. And so that's the piece that we emphasize in Humanistic Judaism. But you know, and we appreciate you going there, because our initiative, Jews for Secular Democracy, we try to stay as pluralistic as we can, but recognize that there's great overlap in the whole liberal Jewish community. A couple of weeks ago, we actually had a nurse practitioner on who was part of the Orthodox community, and he spoke about why he does what he does from his Orthodox Jewish perspective, and it was lovely. So you know, but I particularly appreciate that. And one other thing I wanted to kind of check in with you on is about this pandemic and what you're seeing as far as, you know, first of all, obviously here in New York, and I think the whole country has been following Governor Cuomo's updates and appreciative of at least, you know, what seems to be some actual straight talk about things. What's your take on it? What is your feeling as far as where we're headed with this, and where the light at the end of the tunnel might be? As someone, you know, you're in Manhattan, I'm in Brooklyn. What's your take on where things are right now with this?
Yeah. Well, I would just say that I think we all know the trend is good for New York, and we're doing a good job. That doesn't mean losing 300 New Yorkers yesterday or whatever we're going to lose today is not a tragedy. Hospitalizations are down by a third. Instead of 18,000 people in the hospital, closer to 12,000 people in the hospital. I think this idea that, you know, probably a lot of us are infected. They think on average at least 25% of all New Yorkers have COVID-19, and at some point with, you know, with the vaccine or through exposure, we might get to a place of herd immunity, which is what vaccines really want, at least 90%, if we can get to 95%. Have people who have vaccines. Some of us have it naturally, and some of us will need at some point a vaccination to get it. And then I think we can try to figure out a path back to some level of normalcy. But that's not tomorrow. That's, you know, maybe that's an 18-month plan. So in the interim, how do we function? How do we survive? And I think the way to do it is by connecting to each other in a deep, meaningful way. And, you know, with family, it's a lot of important family time. With communities, a lot of important community time. But it's also important to have strong legislation. And I think the governor, while he's been really giving straight answers, which I think is really important, I think there's some really serious missed moments. And we have a budget in New York State which is taking a nosedive. And instead of deciding to make sure the people who could afford the most paid a bit more, these are the people who got benefited by the Trump tax cuts, who got bailed out in this pandemic in the first bailout, get billions of dollars. What we're seeing is cuts, and where the cuts go are more cuts to the lower income New Yorkers. So people who are suffering the most already through the pandemic, higher instances in Black and Latino communities, communities of color, you know, low wage communities are feeling it the most. So as much as this is a issue of in crowded locations, this is an issue of poverty. And unfortunately, race and poverty go hand in hand in our society. And so what we're doing is we're going to make it worse. We're going to say to those who don't have, you're going to have less. We're going to do Medicaid cuts. We're going to do education cuts. And it's a terrible moment to do that. When students aren't learning, I mean, my kids, luckily enough, both my wife and I are educated, and so our kids might not be learning in school, but they're learning because they come from educated parents. For the people who English isn't their first language, don't have access to technology, those children are really suffering, and they're going to need much more support over the next 6 months than my kids will need. And at the same time, we're going to be cutting resources. So I think some ways he's done a really good job leading us. In some ways he's done an awful job not leading by example, by saying, you know what, in this moment, in this time, taxing higher income earners is the only thing we can do. In every great crisis in our society, a governor of New York, whether it was in 1929 in the Great Depression or in the 50s, when we serious slumps at 58 and 59, whether it was after 9/11 or in a 2008 crisis, we made a decision that we didn't want to just cut. We needed revenue. And so one way to get revenue is to take the 112 billionaires in New York and the tens of thousands of millionaires. We have more millionaires and billionaires in any state in the country, and say, hey, you know what? We're going to squeeze you a little more now. Even though you got all these federal dollars back, we need a little bit for New York State. If we did that, just a 1 or 2% increase in income tax, we'd see $4 billion in new revenue. That's the New York I believe in. That's the government I believe in. And finally, I'll say we're going to need bailout from the federal government. It isn't just this bailout, which is bailing out billions of dollars of large corporations, as you saw in the New York Times today. The bailout has to be for regular people. We need to cancel rent. Today's May Day, Workers' Day. Tenants are struggling. Tenants are on rent strike because they can't afford to pay the rent. And in April, 1/3 of tenants didn't pay their rent because they couldn't afford to. May's only going to be worse. We need to really take leadership. We need to help tenants cancel rent. We need to do a rent freeze for all renters in New York so they don't see rent increases. We need to allow tenants to use their security deposit. So all those things require leadership, and we've been calling on the governor to do it. There's leadership in a pandemic, but a leadership out of a pandemic, and we need both.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. So you touched on it a little bit when you mentioned your mom's observance level. But I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about your own personal Jewish journey and how it led you to where you are now, and whether you see a unique role for the Jewish community in it, or for Judaism in advancing issues in general, but also separation of church and state issues.
Yeah, well, I grew up in a conservative Jewish home. We kept kosher. My mother still keeps kosher, and by the time I was in high school, you know, I questioned all the time as a kid, and so it made natural that I would question my religion as well. So by the time I was in high school, I moved away from those kind of traditional conservative values. I'm much more into kind of liberal progressive values. I became a vegetarian, so I guess in theory I kept being kosher. So I don't eat meat or dairy, so it's easy. And I use my lens of like my social justice, humanistic lens of Judaism to advance my values, and those came from my parents, but those also came out of my ability to question. Like I grew up in a conservative home, and so like my mother wasn't allowed to go to the bima to pray or to read from the Torah. Those values didn't make sense to me. Those like that separation and the discrimination that I felt just didn't feel right. And as a teenager and then into an adult, I realized that they didn't comport with my political values. I needed Judaism, which I believe in, and I'm proud to be a Jew, to have my views, my political views align with my religious views. So as a progressive feminist, racial justice and gender justice needed to all go hand in hand. And the same thing around, sexism, homophobia, and, conservative Judaism. And, this idea that marriage was between a man and a woman made very little sense to me. And I wanted to make sure that people who loved each other, could love each other. And that's kind of how this, from my journey to become much more progressive through college and post-college. And both my children were bar and bat mitzvah. We belong to a temple, but we belong in relation to our social justice values as Jews.
Thank you. I think that speaks to a lot of the folks that certainly we work with on this initiative and in our movement. It speaks to me personally. I also grew up in the conservative movement, and there was such a clear tension between the values that very community was providing to me as a young person and the rules or the religious piece of it that seemed in contrast. And I think perhaps today they do a better job of addressing that tension, but certainly when I was growing up, it felt hypocritical. For me, it was around issues of interfaith marriage, where, as you said, the values was judge everyone as an individual. Don't judge by race, don't judge by religion, except when it comes to marriage. And then, all bets are off, only marry Jewish. That was this conflicting message I was getting from the very same people. And likewise, this community, this conservative synagogue, didn't become egalitarian until I think 5 years ago. But my mom is still very involved, and I remember asking her, and I'm a second generation Jewish communal executive director. She ran a big Jewish community center on Long Island for many years, and dealt with high power people all the time. And I said, Mom, why would you put up with non-egalitarian? And she said, I don't want to get called to the Torah. So she was fine with it. But I'm glad that they're now egalitarian. And I think that tension, though, was a challenge, but it also fired a whole generation of people who I'm sure you're also aware of and working with in the Jewish community to do social justice and to lift everybody up. And as you said before, around, chosenness, that, if anything, it's more like a that we're choosing to take on this mission of improving the world. So I just want to ask, what else, if there's anything else you'd like folks to know about, or other, legislative issues that you're working on that you feel passionate about that you think people should know about. And then after that, I'll hand it over to Lincoln, because I see we're getting some Q&A.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing, or maybe two things. So my values and my Jewish values all kind of play out to, the work I do. So, these issues of affordable housing are about justice and equity, and where I'm fighting for affordable housing because everyone deserves a place to live. So it's deeply rooted in my values. And so in New York State, this issue I've mentioned about canceling rent is important. Same thing with workers' values. People aren't being treated fairly in the workplace. How do we live with ourselves? How do we ensure that people have a decent wage for decent day's work? How do we ensure that people get benefits? How do we ensure, especially on a day like today, when the workers around the world are organizing and have been organizing for decades, how do we infuse Jewish values in that? And then we think about other communities, like the disabled community. I work a lot with people with disabilities, and how discriminated they are in our society, and how, if you look at the unemployment rate before the pandemic, you saw a 30% employment rate for people with disabilities. So 70% of people with disabilities who were employable were unemployed. So, and this is around justice and equity for the disabled community. And think about it. We tell people, some person with disabilities, we're going to help you. We're going to help you go to high school. We're going to spend $1 million on you because you have special needs, and we're going to get you to college, and we're going to provide all the support we can. And then when you turn 22, you know what? We're going to get you Social Security, disability, and then we're going to have you stay home. We just wasted, first of all, financial investment in a person. And second of all, we've given someone so many skills, but without opportunity. So we need to really do a better job for the disability community. Environmental justice, so as you mentioned earlier, this is our planet, and how do we function, and how do we make sure that the issues of climate change are real and we deal with it? I was really disappointed last week. I wrote a letter to the mayor just around ending composting. I mean, this is the third highest contributor to greenhouse gases is compost, and it's food waste in garbage instead of going to landfill. So it's going to landfill. So if we took it all out and did composting, we would reduce one of the third largest contributors to greenhouse gases. And the decision about the mayor saying we're going to end composting is about values and justice. And I think, environmental justice, whether it's wind, solar, electric vehicles, we are so far behind in the idea that if we care about the environment, that we have to act. So we have to make priorities. Those are really critical things that we as New Yorkers need to stand for. The final thing I'll just mention is education. And there's no pathway. My parents, like my father grew up, my grandmother was a single mother raising 3 kids in Brooklyn. My father's older brothers, they went to the military because they could do that. My father luckily got to go to Brooklyn College. It was free, it was accessible. He got a part-time job at the post office, and he made his pathway into the middle class. That doesn't really exist for this generation because we made college unachievable for so many. So how do we ensure education and higher education is accessible for people, especially people who are immigrants and New Yorkers, and make it accessible for them to achieve what people term to be the American dream, the pathway to a better future. And what we've done, unfortunately, is closed it off for a generation of folks.
Great. Well, thank you. And
Thank you.
like I said, many of the things you've said have really resonated with me, and I think with a lot of our folks. And Lincoln, are there some questions? I know we got some questions before we started, and I can see we have some in the Q&A. Are there some that are particularly relevant on things we haven't yet touched on?
Absolutely. We got a lot beforehand, and we've had a lot come up throughout this discussion that I'd love to go through. There is one thing in particular I want to touch on. Assemblymember Epstein, you said earlier something I really liked, which was that a role of government is to educate people as early as possible. And that ties into one question that we got, which is how can we, just as a general community that shares these values, that recognizes the importance of secular government, educate people on the importance of separation of church and state, and so many of those complicated issues. I remember this case at the Supreme Court a couple of years ago with the Colorado bakery that for a lot of people was not super intuitive. Why should this bakery not have the right to deny this same-sex couple, which is, I think, a position that a lot of us share, or these anti-transgender bills that we see in a lot of state. I think for a lot of people, as you recognize and acknowledge, that comes from fear, but how can we help educate people and get them to the right side of those issues?
Right. Well, Lincoln, that's a really good question. I think it's around government prioritizing these issues. Like, when I was growing up, we were taught civics, right? But we weren't taught society. Like, we should mandate that people understand our history, not just our history in the context of what, the Holocaust was, 80 years ago, but how anti-Semitism plays out today. We shouldn't be just discussing slavery, how it existed, 150 years ago, but the impacts of slavery and how it has impacts today. So I think we have to bring history to the current day and mandate that we teach it in school as early as possible. It's not unreasonable to talk to a 5-year-old about race and gender. It's actually really appropriate to have those conversations as early as possible. Not to distinguish, to understand that people, so if you look different, you recognize it. And by not talking about it, you're suppressing it and you're not experiencing it. So a lot of people don't want to talk about it, but you have to talk about race and gender and class and sexuality as early as possible. And government has an obligation to ensure that we do that in our curriculum.
Very good, thank you. Another question that we got submitted ahead of time. Why is it so hard to kick religion out of politics and government? We have church and state codified in our Constitution, separation of them, and yet so many lawmakers continually come back to their own religious values. And I think for a lot of people that creates a tension. I was hoping you could touch on that.
Yeah, have you seen the Pledge of Allegiance, by the way? In the founding beliefs of our government, it was a religious-based system. We pledge, under God, to a flag. These foundational beliefs as religion is a part of who we are. So we talk a lot about religious freedom, but if you didn't want to pledge to under God, you didn't believe in God, you're supposed to stand up and say the pledge. I grew up as a kid, I kind of a rebellious child, and I wouldn't stand and say the pledge, and the teacher hit me because I wouldn't say the pledge, but I didn't believe in it. I didn't believe in saying that I under God to do that. So I think it's not a separation of church and state. It is part of our foundation beliefs. And then a question we have to answer is, when that issue is raised, how do we separate it? How do we, as secular human beings, say, even though I'm a secular Jew, how do I ensure that we separate religion from government? How do we ensure that that doesn't happen? And I believe that other people have a right to whatever they believe, but I have a right to what I believe in. How do we do that? And so that's through education again, early, right? If government said religion's important, so important to so many people in this country, in this world, but where's its place, right? We haven't created a line. We say separation of church and state, but then we let church services happen in our school buildings. We say separation of church and state, and we ask people to say the pledge every day. We say separation of church and state, but we study religious teachings all the time. We say the separation of church and state, but we're not telling people what that actually means. So it's clear, the lines are blurry, so people will push towards their values. They're like, well, it's clear, so I want to make sure my church can have a service, and then we want a prayer group in school, and then we want to pay money for our church group to get money from this institution. And then why shouldn't the government support what we're trying to do? The lines continue to move because the rules are not clear. And we have to create clear rules.
Excellent. Shifting gears a little bit, we got a couple of questions during the conversation today from people interested in the legislative process. And in particular, I think interested in your perspective from being in the room on how do lawmakers get to the point where they're willing to take a stand that might be politically unpopular when there's a risk of political repercussions and consequences? How do you get them over to the issues that we agree with? And I think then more broadly for all of us who aren't elected officials, what can we do to help in that process? What type of advocacy works?
Yeah. You know, that's a $1 million question. How do you stand up for something you believe in and not succumb to the political pressure that's put on you all the time? And it's not an easy answer, because I think people care more about getting reelected than they care about their values sometimes. And so this thing about like money and power and politics plays out in deeply disturbing ways. So this is how I function in that environment. I realize I have to live with myself and figure out what my principles are all the time. And so how do I live with those principles? And it's a balancing act. Every single vote is a balancing act. And I think there's a risk to allowing that to happen. Like when I voted a couple of weeks ago, I voted against the budget along with 23 of my colleagues, because, you know, the risk was, well, if the budget doesn't pass, that means millions of people don't have jobs because they won't have an income. We're going to close the hospital system without a budget. So every person who's in the hospital, you know, do we not, you know, pay those workers? How do we function? But at the end of the day, I had to choose, you know, the trauma that was going to be caused by the budget versus the trauma that was going to be caused by not having a budget, right? And so those are difficult decisions. And the part of that weighing out is obviously leadership wants you to have that budget because everyone's pushing it, and you have to decide how you're going to go along for the ride. And so some people, it's a short-term thing. Mine is the struggle for justice is a long-term struggle. And so it's not going to be just one vote, but I will have to take these votes along the way to stand up for what I believe in. And so you just have to balance it, and it has to be right. But at the end of the day, it has to be just. And justice has to be a format to your values, and it can't be just about re-election. It's got to be about justice.
That's very good to hear. I have a question that's maybe a little bit more personal, and that's just, are you optimistic? You know, one of the things that I've noticed in the last couple of years, especially among generation, among students, and among folks who were less engaged in politics previously, have become a lot more engaged, in part because of what we see happening at the federal level with the Trump administration. But I wonder what your perspective is as an elected official. Are you encouraged by more people stepping up and running for office and wearing their values on their arms and making it clear where they stand?
Yeah, I love people being involved. I love people organizing. I love social justice movements. It is something that speaks deeply to me about people doing transformative change in our society. So more people running, more people being involved, more people becoming a part of the system is an amazing thing to watch, an amazing thing to be a part of. So I'm really hopeful. You know, in the darkest times, it's where you have to have the most hope. And we are living in really dark times, but it's also the time where I have the most hope, because I do think there's a pathway forward. And the pathway is through movements. And it's hard to do social justice building in the context of a pandemic. But in some ways, we are being the most creative during the most difficult time. And that's awe-inspiring. So I'm definitely hopeful, and I'm definitely optimistic, because we will come out of this, and we will come out of this. And the question will be, what happens when we come out? We come out as a different society, where we have much more justice and equity in conversation. We're going to come out where we continue with income inequality, we'll continue with racial injustice and gender imbalance and gender injustice, homophobia, or we come back as a stronger society that cares more about individuals. And that's a choice we all have to make. It doesn't make it easy, but it is a choice.
Great, glad to hear it. A couple more questions that we had submitted during this conversation, one of which related to the makeup of the legislature. Have you seen more secular members elected to the New York State Assembly, and how can we help with doing that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I I do think there's a growth of secular members in New York State, and I think there's a growth of it around the country. And it, it's not like we've organized and saying, hey, these are secular folks, would you come together? But maybe that's a really good idea. Maybe we create a secular coalition in New York State around people who believe in secular humanism. And it doesn't really matter what religions you came from, but it matters what your values are. And that doesn't mean people who are religious aren't important allies and friends, but people who have secular values. I think there's a lot of them out there. People don't generally identify as a forefront of who they are. But it seems like there's a growing value about being secular and humanistic, and maybe we should do something about that.
I'm just going to jump in with a plug for our friends at the Secular Coalition for America, because they actually helped facilitate a free thought caucus in Congress about a year and a half ago. And I think they're up to 15 members or so.
Wow.
And you don't have to
13,
be,
but we're getting there.
As with any caucus in the House of Representatives, you don't need to necessarily self-identify with that group. You don't need to be a farmer to be part of the farmer caucus. You just have to care about what the needs are of that particular population. So that was something that we who work in the secular community were very excited about, and perhaps doing it on state levels would be really something unique and exciting.
Yeah, I'm happy to actually do that. So maybe we can talk off Facebook to how we move that forward. I think it was a fabulous idea, something we can totally do off cycle for the legislative session.
That'll be exciting. Thanks.
Sure.
Got one more for you from the Q&A box. One of our attendees today is concerned, I think especially during this public health crisis, that there are violations of certain healthcare rights in religiously affiliated hospitals, that we see hospital systems that are affiliated with, for example, the Catholic Church, that are making medical decisions based on religious values rather than necessarily the best interests or the wishes of the patients. Is there a state legislative response to that? What can the state do to ensure that every hospital patient is getting the care that they deserve?
Well, if they do that, it's a violation of state law already. So anytime, if you hear about it, let us know. This homophobic group that is now occupying Central Park has got a terrible history of injustice and under the guise of religion, and they've committed to not discriminating against anyone for services. I've really been disappointed that the mayor allowed homophobic organization to occupy our public space. But saying that's, he's the mayor, not me. And so what we need to do is make sure they're accountable to our city and state laws to protect all New Yorkers, no matter who you are, whether you're transgender, whatever your religious is, your race, or your gender.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I'm really blown away by so many of the things you had to say today, and we will be in touch. And thank you for the service that you do on behalf of all of us, and certainly speaking as a New Yorker, I really appreciate it. And as a New Yorker who pays rent, by the way. But luckily, thankfully, I'm doing okay, and I hope you are as well, and I hope all of our participants are doing well, because it's a very strange and difficult time. And I also just now would like to kind of wrap up by passing it over to our colleague at Jews for Secular Democracy, Sarah Levin, to just briefly explain some of the things we're thinking about coming up. Sarah, do you want to talk a little bit about it?
Absolutely. And just in case, unfortunately, I've had some connection issues. So if I disappear, just move on without me. But hopefully that won't happen. I'll make this quick. So events like this are things you can organize yourself in your state. You can invite your state and local elected officials to talk to you about the issues. And that's the kind of thing that we want to work with you on. So if you want to educate folks about separation of religion and government issues, if you want to take direct action on issues that are happening in your state, in your area, if you want to engage folks not just in the Jewish community but outside of it on these issues and elevate the voices of Jews who care about these issues, we have a volunteer program. So please contact me or Lincoln. I'm at sarah@jfasd.org. justice.org. You can sign up to volunteer on the website. And we are providing trainings very soon on how to advocate effectively, how to educate folks about these issues, and how to do events just like this. So please reach out to us. We have resources coming out, and we are very excited to empower our supporters to make a difference on these issues.
Great, thank you.
I also want to thank you for reaching out to me and letting me be a part of this. I really appreciate all your time, and I hope that this was helpful and meaningful to the people who joined us.
It very much was. Thank you so much, Representative.
It really was. And folks who have further questions, who want to be in touch with me directly, feel free, and we will keep you posted on other upcoming things. And thank you again, Assembly Member.
Thank you. Be safe, everyone.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.